November 24th, 1944. Captain Tatsuo Yamada pulls his oxygen mask tight against his face, the rubber seal cold against his skin in the unheated cockpit. Dawn breaks over Chofu Airfield, painting Mount Fuji's distant peak in shades of pink and gold. In the briefing hut 20 minutes earlier, intelligence officers had spoken words that seemed impossible. American bombers approaching at altitudes no one had ever fought at before. Heights where the air itself becomes an enemy. Yamada's Kawasaki Ki-61HIN sits on the tarmac, its inline engine already warming with a mechanical growl that echoes across the base. 4 12.7mm machine guns and 2 20mm cannons bristle from its wings. Weapons that had torn through Chinese bombers and Allied fighters for 3 years. This morning, they might as well be toys. The call comes at 0730 hours. Scramble. What Captain Yamada is about to discover will shatter everything Japanese pilots believe about aerial combat. In the next 4 hours, he and his fellow interceptors will confront not just American bombers, but a technological chasm so vast that no amount of courage can bridge it. They are about to fight an enemy that exists in a realm their aircraft can barely reach, protected by innovations their engineers never imagined possible. This is the story of November 24, 1944. The day 111 Boeing B-29 Superfortresses demonstrated that modern war is no longer decided by the warrior's spirit, but by the engineer's slide rule. It's the story of Japanese pilots who climbed until their engines caught fire, only to watch silver bombers pass overhead like untouchable gods. And it's the story of how American industrial might created a weapon so technologically superior that it rendered an entire nation's air defenses obsolete before the first bomb fell. To understand what happened over Tokyo that November morning, we must first understand the machine that made it possible. The Boeing B-29 Superfortress wasn't just another bomber, it was a flying statement of American industrial supremacy, a weapon system that pushed the boundaries of aviation technology further than any aircraft before it. Picture this: a silver giant stretching 99 feet long with a wingspan of 141 feet, powered by 4 Wright R3350 duplex Cyclone engines, each producing 2,200 horsepower, numbers that meant nothing to ground observers but everything to the men who tried to fight it. But the B-29's true revolution lay hidden inside its aluminum skin. While every bomber before it forced crews to endure freezing temperatures and gasping for breath through oxygen masks, the Superfortress offered something almost unimaginable: pressurized cabins. Engineers had created sealed compartments where men could work at 30,000 feet in shirt sleeves, breathing normally, maintaining peak performance while their enemies below struggled against hypoxia and frostbite. The pressurization system itself represented engineering wizardry. Cabin altitude stayed at a comfortable 8,000-foot equivalent, while the aircraft cruised above 30,000 feet. Crew members moved freely between stations through a tunnel that ran over the bomb bays, a design that turned the bomber into a flying workplace rather than a freezing death trap. Temperature control, humidity regulation, systems that previous generations of aviators couldn't have dreamed of. Then came the engines. Wright Aeronautical Corporation's R3350 featured something that separated it from every Japanese engine in production: turbo-superchargers. These devices compressed the thin air at altitude, feeding oxygen-rich mixture to the engines, maintaining sea-level power where naturally aspirated engines gasped and died. Japanese engineers understood the principle. They'd captured technical documents, but lacked the precision manufacturing capability, the special alloys, the industrial infrastructure to produce them in meaningful numbers. Boeing's designers had prioritized altitude from the beginning. The Army Air Forces specified an aircraft capable of carrying 2,000 pounds of bombs 5,333 miles at altitudes above 30,000 feet. Every design decision flowed from that requirement. pressurization for the crew, turbo-supercharging for the engines, structural reinforcement to handle pressurization stress, remote-controlled defensive armament that didn't require gunners to sit in freezing, exposed positions. The defensive system itself showcased American innovation. Instead of traditional gun positions where freezing gunners manually tracked targets, the B-29 featured the Central Fire Control System, analog computers that tracked multiple targets simultaneously while gunners operated from heated, pressurized compartments. Radar-directed fire in darkness, coordinated defensive coverage that previous bombers couldn't achieve. A single gunner could control multiple turrets, maintaining accuracy even during violent evasive maneuvers. Consider the complexity. Each B-29 contained 55,000 separate parts. More than 1,200 companies contributed components. The engines alone represented 5 years of development, solving problems with vibration and overheating that killed test pilots. Boeing spent $3 billion developing and producing the Superfortress, more than the Manhattan Project that built the atomic bomb. But it was the altitude capability that mattered most that November morning. While Japanese pilots had grown accustomed to fighting between 15,000 and 25,000 feet, the B-29 routinely operated between 27,000 and 32,000 feet. This wasn't just higher, it was a completely different operational realm where the rules of aerial combat changed fundamentally. At 30,000 feet, air pressure drops to less than 1/3 of sea level. Temperatures plunge to -40 degrees Fahrenheit or colder. The human body struggles to extract oxygen from air so thin. Aircraft controls become sluggish. Engines lose power exponentially. It's an environment where only specially designed machines can function, and the B-29 was designed precisely for this hostile realm. The Japanese knew American bombers were coming. They'd tracked B-24 Liberators and B-17 Fortresses from China bases for months, but those aircraft operated at conventional altitudes within reach of Japanese fighters. The intelligence reports filtering into Tokyo through October and November 1944 spoke of something different. Massive 4-engine bombers spotted over newly captured Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. Initial altitude estimates proved wildly optimistic. Analysts predicted 25,000 to 27,000 feet, uncomfortable but manageable for Japanese interceptors. They were wrong by nearly a mile.
Captain Yamada's Ki-61 Heen represented the best Japan could field in late 1944. The name meant flying swallow, chosen for its graceful lines and reputation for agility. Kawasaki's designers had created a sleek fighter powered by a license-built German DB601 inline engine producing 1,175 horsepower, impressive by Japanese standards. The Heen could reach 368 miles per hour at 16,400 feet, turning tightly enough to outmaneuver most Allied fighters. On paper, specifications claimed a service ceiling of 36,000 feet. In reality, combat performance degraded catastrophically above 28,000 feet. The engine, lacking effective supercharging, produced barely half its rated power in thin air. Controls became mushy, unresponsive. Pilots reported feeling like they were flying through molasses at extreme altitude. Every control input delayed, every maneuver requiring twice the effort. The Ki-61's design reflected Japan's tactical reality through 1943, combat against Chinese forces and Allied fighters and medium bombers at conventional altitudes where agility and firepower mattered more than ceiling. It excelled between 15,000 and 25,000 feet, exactly where most Pacific aerial combat occurred, but that tactical environment was about to change forever. Japan's other frontline interceptor, the Nakajima K-44 Shoki, Devil Queller, prioritized climb rate over maneuverability. Shorter, stubbier than the Heen, powered by a radial engine producing 1,520 horsepower, the Shoki could climb to 15,000 feet in just over 5 minutes. Designers specifically intended it for bomber interception, sacrificing range and agility for vertical performance. But even the Shoki hit walls of physics above 30,000 feet. The Nakajima HA-109 engine, though powerful at medium altitudes, choked on thin air. Cylinder head temperature soared into the red zone. Oil pressure fluctuated dangerously. Pilots could maintain 28,000 feet for perhaps 30 seconds before the engine began destroying itself. Above that, stalls came quickly, unforgivingly. Major Toshio Sakagawa commanded the elite 244th Sentai, one of Japan's most experienced fighter units. His pilots had accumulated thousands of combat hours, many with multiple victories against Chinese and Allied aircraft. They understood energy management, deflection shooting, coordinated attacks. Veterans who'd survived years of combat. None of it prepared them for what was coming. Japanese tactical doctrine emphasized attacking from above, diving on bomber formations to build speed while maintaining energy. Pilots trained to position themselves 5,000 to 8,000 feet above targets before attacking, using gravity and momentum for slashing passes. The diving attack allowed fighters to break away quickly, avoiding defensive fire, while setting up for another pass. But this doctrine assumed fighters could reach altitude above their targets. Against B-17s and B-24s flying at 22,000 to 25,000 feet, Japanese fighters could climb to 30,000 feet and attack from advantageous positions. Against B-29s at 31,000 feet, climbing to 36,000 feet proved impossible. The tactical foundation of Japanese air defense collapsed before the first engagement. Ground-based radar stations around Tokyo could track incoming formations from hundreds of miles away. Operators at Chiba Detection Station had state-of-the-art equipment providing early warning and tracking information to fighter control. But warning meant nothing when interceptors lacked the performance to reach bomber altitude. Controllers would vector fighters toward intercept points, knowing the mission was likely futile. Listening as pilots reported maximum altitude achieved, always thousands of feet too low. Lieutenant Commander Minoru Genda, one of Japan's most brilliant tactical minds, had anticipated this problem months earlier. His reports to Naval Headquarters emphasized developing high-altitude interceptors immediately. But Japan's aircraft industry struggled with more basic challenges: aluminum shortages, precision tooling limitations, inadequate alloy development. Creating new high-altitude engines required special steels for turbo-superchargers, temperature-resistant alloys for cylinder heads, precision manufacturing for tight tolerances. Japan's wartime industrial base couldn't produce these components in meaningful quantities. Attempts to modify existing fighters for better altitude performance fell short. Engineers stripped armor plating, removed radios, reduced ammunition loads, everything to save weight. These lightened fighters achieved marginally better ceiling, perhaps an extra 1,000 feet. But modifications came at terrible cost. Pilots flew without protection, couldn't communicate with controllers, carried barely enough ammunition for one brief engagement, and they still couldn't reach the B-29s. The psychological preparation proved even more inadequate than the technical. Japanese fighter pilots had developed immense confidence through victories in China and early Pacific campaigns. They'd grown accustomed to aerial superiority, dictating engagement terms, choosing when and where to fight. That confidence would shatter against an enemy that occupied a realm beyond reach. November 24, 1944, 8:00 hours. Radar operators at Chiba Station stare at their scopes, watching phosphorescent blips materialize from the southeast. The formation stretches across their screens. Not a small raid, but a massive effort. Controllers begin counting: 20 contacts, 30, 50. Final tally: 111 aircraft at ranges exceeding 200 miles. The raid represents culmination of months of planning. Brigadier General Haywood Hansel commands 21st Bomber Command from Guam, where he'd spent weeks orchestrating the logistics nightmare of deploying B-29s across the Central Pacific. Each bomber requires 7,000 gallons of fuel, tons of bombs, spare parts, maintenance crews, ammunition. The Marianas Island bases at Tinian, Saipan, and Guam had been carved from jungle and coral, built by construction battalions working around the clock. The target, Nakajima Aircraft Company's Musashino engine plant on Tokyo's western outskirts. This facility produced HA-45 engines for Japan's latest fighters, critical production for homeland defense. Destroy it, and Japan's already struggling aviation industry suffers a crippling blow. Intelligence photos showed the plant's layout clearly. American reconnaissance aircraft had been mapping Japanese industry for months. Captain Yamada receives the scramble order at 8:15. The briefing is rushed. Large formation of 4 engine bombers, estimated altitude 27,000 to 30,000 feet, bearing from the southeast. Controllers emphasize maximum altitude intercept. Get above them if possible. Attack from advantageous position. Yamada exchanges glances with his wingman, Lieutenant Kenji Matsuda. Both men understand what those altitude figures mean. The Ki-61 engines roar to life across Chofu Airfield, their inline power plants creating a symphony of mechanical fury. Yamada runs through his pre-flight checks with practiced efficiency, but his mind keeps returning to those altitude figures. He'd attempted high-altitude intercept training flights 3 weeks ago, managed to reach 32,000 feet for perhaps 15 seconds before his engine began cooking itself. The cockpit had been so cold that his hands went numb despite heavy gloves. Breathing became labored even through the oxygen mask. Takeoff at 8:25. Yamada retracts his landing gear and begins a steady climbing turn toward the southeast, maintaining maximum continuous climb power. The Kawasaki HA-40 engine pulls strongly in the morning air, propeller biting efficiently. At 10,000 feet, Tokyo spreads below, a vast urban landscape of wooden buildings, narrow streets, traditional architecture mixed with modern factories. Somewhere down there, his wife and daughter are preparing for their day, unaware of the danger approaching from the Pacific.
Other formations join from neighboring bases. Ki-44 Shokis from Matsudo, more Ki-61s from Tachikawa. Ground controllers coordinate intercept geometry, vectoring fighters toward optimal intercept positions. But the bombers maintain their inexorable approach, eating up miles while Japanese fighters claw for altitude. Yamada's altimeter passes 15,000 feet. The climb rate remains good, over 1,500 feet per minute. Outside temperature drops steadily, already minus 10 degrees Fahrenheit and falling. He checks his oxygen flow, ensuring the system feeds properly. At 20,000 feet, he should be fine. At 30,000, he'll be fighting for every breath despite the mask. Meanwhile, 200 miles to the southeast, Captain Robert Morgan settles into the pilot's seat of Dauntless Dottie, his B-29 cruising comfortably at 27,000 feet. The cockpit feels almost luxurious compared to previous bombers he'd flown. Pressurized, heated, spacious. His flight engineer, Technical Sergeant James Carlson, monitors the 4 R-3350 engines, watching temperatures and pressures with satisfaction. The turbo-superchargers are doing their job perfectly, maintaining power where Japanese engines would be gasping. Navigator Captain Theodore Van Kirk hunches over his charts in the compartment behind the pilots. Through the bombardier's clear nose section forward, he can see other B-29s maintaining formation, a sight that never fails to impress him. Sunlight glints off their polished aluminum skins, creating a field of silver stars against blue sky. Each aircraft carries approximately 2.5 tons of bombs, targeting different sections of the Nakajima plant. Total payload, 277 tons of high explosive, enough to level city blocks. The formation flies in loose combat boxes. aircraft spaced to avoid collision while maintaining mutual defensive support. Some bombers cruise at 27,000 feet, others at 29,000 or 31,000. Altitude variation designed to complicate interceptor attacks. Weather conditions are nearly perfect. Clear skies, light winds at altitude, unlimited visibility. Perfect for bombing, perfect for observing whatever Japanese defenses attempt. Staff Sergeant William Akers, manning the central fire control system, watches his radar scope for enemy fighters. The CFC station sits in the bomber's center, surrounded by analog computers and tracking equipment. From here, he can control 4 remote turrets simultaneously, directing devastating firepower against multiple threats without leaving his pressurized compartment. But so far, his scope shows nothing. No fighters climbing to intercept. At 0920, that changes. Yamada's altimeter reads 25,000 feet. The climb has slowed dramatically, barely 800 feet per minute now, and dropping. His engine temperature gauges hover near redline as the Ha-40 struggles with oxygen-starved air. Outside temperature registers minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit and falling. He checks his oxygen flow, ensuring the system feeds properly. At 20,000 feet, he should be fine. At 30,000, he'll be fighting for every breath despite the mask. But then, he sees them. Contrails, dozens of white lines scratched across the sky, each marking a B-29's passage. But they're so high, impossibly high. Yamada estimates 30,000 feet, possibly more. The bombers appear as tiny silver specks at the head of each contrail, glinting in morning sunlight. Beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. Lieutenant Matsuda's voice crackles over the radio, thin and strained from altitude. "They're above us, Captain. Way above." Other pilots report similar observations. Controllers vector additional fighters toward the formation, but everyone can see the problem. The bombers occupy space thousands of feet above Japanese ceiling. Ground control orders fighters to continue climbing, achieve maximum possible altitude before attempting engagement. Yamada pushes his aircraft harder. The manifold pressure gauge shows emergency power, well beyond normal operational limits. His engine's going to require complete overhaul after this flight, if it survives. The Ki-61 claws upward, airspeed bleeding off as altitude increases. At 27,000 feet, he's managing barely 180 miles per hour, wallowing through air so thin his control surfaces barely respond. The bombers maintain their stately progress toward Tokyo, contrails stretching behind them like accusatory fingers. Yamada can see individual aircraft now, make out their distinctive shape, longer and sleeker than B-17s with that high tail and massive wings. They're not taking evasive action, not maneuvering at all, just flying straight and level, as if Japanese fighters don't exist. Which, at this altitude, they effectively don't. Yamada's altimeter touches 28,000 feet, his maximum. The high end hangs on the edge of a stall, controls mushy, engine screaming in protest. He can maintain this altitude for perhaps 30 seconds before physics wins. Through his gun sight, he can see bombers passing overhead, still 3,000 feet above him. Might as well be 30,000. He attempts a zoom climb, trading all his airspeed for a brief altitude burst. The Ki-61 shoots upward like a rocket, Yamada pulling back hard on the stick. Altimeter spins 29,000 feet, 29,500, 30,000 feet. His airspeed indicator drops below stall speed. The nose points almost vertical. For one glorious moment, he's at bomber altitude, close enough to see markings on the nearest B-29's fuselage. Then the stall hits like a sledgehammer. The high-end shudders, nose dropping violently. Yamada fights for control as his fighter tumbles, altitude unwinding rapidly, 29,000 feet, 28,000 feet, 27,000 feet. He recovers at 25,000 feet, engine coughing, oil pressure fluctuating dangerously.
The bomber he'd targeted continues serenely toward Tokyo, completely unaffected by his desperate attempt. Similar stories play out across the sky. Dozens of Japanese fighters attempting the impossible, climbing until their engines fail, trying zoom climbs that fall short, firing guns at targets just beyond effective range. A few pilots managed to fire brief bursts, their machine gun rounds and cannon shells arcing upward before losing velocity in thin air, falling away harmlessly. Captain Morgan watches the spectacle from Dauntless Dottie's cockpit with mixture of relief and something approaching pity. Through his side window, he observes Japanese fighters far below, climbing desperately. Some attempt zoom climbs, shooting upward briefly before stalling and tumbling. It's almost sad. Brave men in inadequate machines fighting against physics itself. Fighters at 5 o'clock low, his Kale gunner reports. Looks like Ki-61s. They're trying to climb to us. Are they in range? Morgan asks. Negative. Must be 3,000 or 4,000 feet below us. I don't think they can reach our altitude. Morgan nods, focusing on maintaining formation. His B-29 performs beautifully at this altitude, engines purring smoothly, controls responsive despite the thin air. The technological superiority feels almost unfair. His crew works comfortably in shirt sleeves, while Japanese pilots freeze and gasp for oxygen below. American industrial might versus Japanese determination, and determination isn't enough.
Understanding what happened that morning requires understanding just how wide the technological gap had become. This wasn't about one side having slightly better equipment. It was about fundamental industrial and scientific capabilities that created insurmountable advantages. Start with the engines. Wright Aeronautical's R-3350 duplex Cyclone represented the culmination of American piston engine development. 18 cylinders arranged in 2 rows, each cylinder featuring sodium-cooled valves, precision-machined tolerances, and metallurgy the Japanese industry couldn't replicate. But the real magic happened in the turbo-supercharger. General Electric's turbo-supercharger system used exhaust gases to spin a turbine, which drove a compressor that forced air into the engine at sea-level pressure regardless of altitude. This meant the R-3350 could produce 2,200 horsepower at 30,000 feet, altitude where Japanese engines produced less than half their rated power. The system required precision manufacturing, special heat-resistant alloys, and sophisticated control mechanisms. Japan had captured technical documents describing turbo-supercharging, but lacked the industrial infrastructure to produce them. The difference manifested dramatically in combat. At 30,000 feet, a B-29's engines operated in their design envelope, maintaining cruise power comfortably. A Ki-61's engine operated beyond its design limits, overheating within minutes, producing barely enough power to maintain level flight. Japanese pilots would return from missions needing complete engine overhauls, if they returned at all. Consider the oxygen systems. American crews breathed from a centralized oxygen generation system that provided consistent flow regardless of altitude. Japanese pilots relied on portable oxygen bottles with basic regulators. At extreme altitude, these systems frequently malfunctioned, causing hypoxia that dulled reactions and clouded judgment. Several Japanese pilots passed out during high-altitude interception attempts, some never recovering consciousness. Then there was pressurization. This technology transformed high-altitude operations from endurance tests into routine procedures. Boeing's pressurization system maintained 8,000-foot equivalent cabin pressure through complex sealed compartments and pressure regulators. The engineering required was extraordinary. Every rivet had to seal perfectly. Every hatch needed pressure-tight mechanisms. The fuselage structure had to handle pressure differentials without failing. Japanese engineers understood pressurization theory. They'd studied captured documents and German technical data, but practical implementation required manufacturing capabilities they simply didn't possess. Creating pressure-tight seals demanded synthetic rubber compounds Japan couldn't produce.
The structural reinforcement needed precision welding techniques and quality control beyond Japanese industrial standards. Even basic components like pressure regulators required precision machining tools that weren't available. The cumulative advantages multiplied effectiveness beyond simple altitude. American crews working in comfortable conditions maintained peak performance throughout missions. They could navigate precisely, communicate clearly, operate complex equipment efficiently. Japanese pilots, fighting cold and oxygen deprivation, struggled with basic tasks, their effectiveness degrading with every minute at extreme altitude. The defensive armament showcased another technological chasm. The B-29's central fire control system used analog computers to calculate lead angles, tracking multiple targets simultaneously, while gunners operated remotely. Each gunner could control multiple turrets, creating overlapping fields of fire that previous bombers couldn't achieve. The system incorporated radar ranging, automatic tracking, and electronic compensation for aircraft speed and altitude. Japanese fighter pilots reported unprecedented defensive fire accuracy. American gunners could track targets through evasive maneuvers, maintain firing solutions during violent combat maneuvering. The automated system compensated for the bomber's motion, calculated proper lead angles, and directed fire with machine precision. It was like fighting an opponent with extrasensory perception. Moreover, the remote control nature meant battle damage to individual gun positions didn't create defensive blind spots. In B-17s and B-24s, killed gunners meant undefended arcs. In B-29s, other gunners could take over damaged turrets electronically. The technological advantage compounded survival rates dramatically. Back over Tokyo, the one-sided battle continues. At 09:45, the first B-29s reached their initial points, beginning bomb runs over the Nakajima plant. Bombardiers peer through Norden bomb sites, making final calculations. But there's a problem the mission planners hadn't anticipated: wind. At 30,000 feet, the jet stream, a phenomenon barely understood in 1944, howls at over 200 miles per hour. These high-altitude winds blow from west to east, pushing bombers rapidly across their targets. Bombardiers struggle to compensate, adjusting drift angles desperately, but the winds exceed anything they'd trained for in the United States. Bombs fall in streams, tumbling through thin air toward targets 30,000 feet below. Many drift east of the intended target, hitting residential areas instead of the factory. Only 24 of the 111 aircraft managed direct hits on the primary target. Others bomb secondary targets or miss entirely. The physical destruction proves disappointing compared to effort expended. But the psychological impact is profound. Ground observers watch vapor trails crossing Tokyo's sky at previously unimaginable altitude, utterly beyond reach of defending fighters. The message is clear. Japan's cities lie naked before American air power. No amount of courage or determination can prevent what's coming. Japanese anti-aircraft batteries fire desperately. The largest guns theoretically can reach 30,000 feet, but accuracy at such altitude proves virtually impossible. Shell dispersion patterns mean hitting anything requires incredible luck. Black puffs of flak burst thousands of feet below the bombers, marking only Japanese frustration. Gunners fire thousands of rounds without achieving a single confirmed hit. American bombers proceed through the barrage untouched, their altitude sanctuary proving more effective than any armor. Yamada makes 3 more desperate attempts to reach the bombers, each ending in failure. His engine temperature gauges stay pegged in the red zone. Oil pressure fluctuates alarmingly. After his 4th zoom climb attempt, the HA-40 begins missing, coughing black smoke. He's pushed the engine beyond endurance. Lieutenant Matsuda's fighter suffered similar damage, forced to break off and return to base with a dying power plant. Across the sky, similar stories multiply. The 244th Sentai, one of Japan's elite units, achieves exactly 0 successful attacks against the formation. The 47th Sentai's Ki-44 interceptors manage to reach marginally better altitude but still fall short of effective engagement range. Pilots expend ammunition in few long-range shots, their bullets falling short or losing velocity before reaching targets. Only one B-29 falls to Japanese action that day, not through conventional combat, but through a ramming attack. Sergeant Masatsugu Itaki deliberately crashes his damaged Ki-61 into a straggling bomber. Both aircraft plunge into Tokyo Bay, taking their crews with them. Itaki's sacrifice represents ultimate dedication, but one victory from dozens of interception attempts demonstrates the tactical bankruptcy of Japanese air defense.
The raid ends at 11:30. Surviving B-29s turn southeast toward the Marianas, contrails gradually dissipating in high-altitude winds. They leave behind a city awakened to its vulnerability, a fighter force demoralized by impotence, and military leadership recognizing that Japan's air defense strategy has failed fundamentally. The November 24th raid forced brutal reassessment of Japanese defensive capabilities. In conference rooms across Tokyo, military leaders confronted uncomfortable truths. Their fighters couldn't reach American bombers. Their anti-aircraft guns couldn't hit them. Their tactics couldn't stop them. The technological gap had rendered traditional defensive doctrine obsolete. Major Teruhiko Kobayashi of the 244th Sentai spent days after the raid analyzing what went wrong and exploring solutions. His unit had performed flawlessly by pre-war standards, achieving altitude quickly, maintaining formation discipline, and executing attacks aggressively. Yet they'd accomplished nothing. The problem wasn't tactics or courage, it was physics. Kobayashi proposed desperate measures. Strip fighters of all unnecessary weight, remove armor plating, discard radios, reduce ammunition loads, drain fuel to minimum necessary. These modifications might gain 1,000 to 1,500 feet of ceiling, potentially enough to reach bomber altitude. The cost would be severe. Pilots would fly unprotected, unable to communicate, carrying barely enough ammunition for brief engagements. But what choice remained? The modifications began immediately. Maintenance crews worked through December nights stripping Ki-61s and Ki-44s down to bare essentials. Some pilots removed their parachutes, reasoning that bailing out from extreme altitude meant death anyway. They painted their aircraft bright colors, red noses, yellow tails, so ground observers could identify which units were engaging, providing at least psychological reassurance to civilians below. December 3rd brought another massive raid, 86 B-29s targeting the same Nakajima plant. Japanese response implemented new tactics based on November's hard lessons. Fighters positioned at maximum altitude before bombers arrived, hoping to dive on them with energy advantage rather than attempting impossible climbs during combat. It didn't work. Even starting from optimal positions, stripped fighters couldn't maintain bomber altitude long enough for sustained engagement. Captain Teruhiko Kobayashi led a formation of lightened Ki-61s, achieving 31,000 feet before the bombers arrived. For perhaps 2 minutes, they maintained altitude slightly above the bomber stream. Then engines began overheating, oil pressure dropping, controls becoming unresponsive. The brief altitude advantage evaporated as physics reasserted itself. Lieutenant Saburo Hayashi volunteered for something even more desperate, the Shin-10 Special Attack Unit. Not kamikaze in the traditional sense, these pilots didn't seek to die, but accepted death as probable outcome. Their mission? Ram B-29s at extreme altitude if guns failed to achieve results. Hayashi's modified Ki-61 carried minimal fuel, no armor, and just enough ammunition for one brief engagement. The weight savings bought him perhaps 500 additional feet of ceiling. On December 27th, he achieved 31,500 feet during an interception attempt, close enough to see rivets on a bomber's wing. He fired his remaining ammunition in a 3-second burst, observing hits on the B-29's No. 3 engine. Then his fighter stalled, tumbling through 5,000 feet before he recovered control. The bomber heat hit continued to target, its 3 remaining engines easily compensating for the damaged power plant. American engineering had designed redundancy into every system. Lose an engine, 3 others maintained flight. Lose oxygen, pressurization systems had backups. Lose electrical power, multiple generators and backup systems prevented catastrophic failure. Japanese fighters, designed for weight efficiency, lacked such redundancy. One critical hit meant mission failure or death. Through December 1944 and January 1945, B-29 raids intensified. Formations struck Tokyo, Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, Japan's industrial heartland. Each raid followed similar patterns, Japanese fighters climbing desperately, achieving insufficient altitude, firing futile shots at targets beyond reach. The technological mismatch created psychological trauma beyond combat stress. Pilots felt they'd failed their nation, their emperor, their ancestors, not through cowardice, but through equipment inadequacy. Former Ki-61 pilot Lieutenant Naoshi Kano recalled the psychological devastation. "We climbed with everything our engines could give us, watching temperature gauges go into red zones. My flight leader's engine caught fire at 28,000 feet. He bailed out while I continued climbing, reaching perhaps 30,000 feet before my controls became completely ineffective. The B-29s passed overhead like silver ghosts, unreachable despite our desperate efforts. The frustration and shame of being unable to protect our homeland haunted us more than fear of death." The few successes achieved came against damaged stragglers, bombers suffering mechanical problems that forced them to descend. These vulnerable aircraft fell victim to coordinated attacks, demonstrating that Japanese pilots and tactics remained effective when altitude disadvantage disappeared. But healthy B-29s at operational altitude remained effectively invulnerable. Japanese aircraft industry desperately pursued high-altitude interceptor development. The Mitsubishi J-2M Raiden featured supercharged engines designed for extreme altitude combat. The Kawasaki Ki-102 heavy fighter carried powerful armament specifically for bomber destruction. Development programs suffered from critical material shortages, particularly high-grade aluminum and special alloys needed for superchargers and turbo-supercharging systems.
Moreover, B-29 raids systematically destroyed Japanese aircraft factories. The Nakajima plant at Musashino, repeatedly targeted, eventually ceased production. The Mitsubishi engine works at Nagoya burned in January 1945. Each raid degraded Japan's industrial capacity further, widening the technological gap even as Japanese engineers sought to close it. January 1945 brought new leadership to 21st Bomber Command. Major General Curtis LeMay assumed command with characteristic intensity, immediately analyzing high-altitude daylight rate effectiveness with dissatisfaction. Despite technological superiority, bombing accuracy remained poor. The jet stream winds discovered at altitude, sometimes exceeding 250 miles per hour, pushed bombers rapidly across targets, making precision bombing nearly impossible. LeMay reviewed the numbers coldly. Less than 10% of bombs hit intended targets. Cloud cover frequently obscured targets during winter months, forcing radar bombing with minimal precision. While B-29s suffered minimal losses, they weren't achieving strategic effects commensurate with resources expended. Something had to change. He made a revolutionary decision that would transform the air war. Strip the B-29s of most defensive armament, load them with incendiary bombs, and send them against urban areas at low altitude during night attacks. The decision shocked many. It meant abandoning the altitude sanctuary that had protected B-29s from Japanese defenses. At 5,000 to 9,000 feet, every Japanese fighter could reach bomber altitude. Anti-aircraft guns would engage at point-blank range. Yet LeMay calculated the gamble was worth it. Night operations would confuse defenses, overwhelming numbers would saturate defensive capabilities, and incendiary attacks against Japan's wood and paper cities would create effects precision bombing couldn't achieve. March 9, 1945, witnessed Operation Meeting House, the devastating Tokyo firebombing that would kill more people in a single night than any other air raid in history, including both atomic attacks. Lieutenant Yoshio Mitsuyoshi scrambled from Matsudo Airfield at 0130, finally able to reach bomber altitude without difficulty. His Nakajima K-44 climbed strongly toward targets reported at 7,000 feet. After months of futile high-altitude attempts, the tactical situation had reversed dramatically. But night combat presented entirely different challenges. Without airborne radar or effective ground control, Japanese fighters struggled to locate targets in darkness. Searchlights stabbed upward, illuminating individual bombers for brief moments before losing them. Anti-aircraft fire created chaos, black puffs of flak mixed with glowing tracers, stitching patterns across darkness. In the confusion, Japanese fighters conducted uncoordinated single attacks, hoping for lucky encounters rather than executing planned tactics. Mitsuyoshi spotted a B-29 silhouetted against searchlights, its silver skin glowing eerily. He maneuvered for a stern attack, closing to 300 yards before opening fire. His cannons hammered, orange tracers reaching toward the bomber. He observed hits on the No. 2 engine nacelle, saw smoke streaming, but the Superfortress maintained formation, proceeding toward its target despite damage. Defensive fire erupted from the bomber's tail turret, radar-directed streams of .50 caliber rounds that forced Mitsuyoshi into violent evasive maneuvers. He pulled away, setting up for another pass but lost the bomber in darkness. Other B-29s appeared and vanished like ghosts, their presence marked only by searchlight illumination or engine sounds. Below, Tokyo began to burn. The 334 B-29s dropped 1,665 tons of incendiary bombs, M69 clusters that scattered magnesium and napalm across vast areas. The bombs were designed specifically to ignite Japanese construction, wood frames, paper walls, tatami floors. Within 30 minutes, fires merged into a conflagration that created its own weather system. Superheated air rose rapidly, pulling in oxygen from surrounding areas at hurricane speeds. The firestorm consumed 16 square miles of Tokyo, killing an estimated 100,000 civilians in the deadliest single air raid in history. From his cockpit, Mitsuyoshi watched his city transform into an inferno. Orange flames reflected off his canopy, creating nightmare illumination that revealed the scale of destruction. Entire neighborhoods vanished in fire. The thermal updrafts buffeted his fighter violently, forcing him thousands of feet higher. He could smell the smoke, even at altitude, feel the heat through his canopy. He made 3 more attack runs, observing hits on 2 bombers, but achieving no confirmed kills. The B-29s demonstrated remarkable durability, absorbing tremendous punishment while continuing to targets. Remote-controlled turrets engaged attacking fighters efficiently even in darkness, their radar direction providing accuracy that surprised Japanese pilots trained in daylight combat. Japanese fighters claimed 14 B-29s destroyed that night, the highest toll of the war. But they couldn't prevent catastrophic damage to the capital. The low altitude that enabled interception also enabled overwhelming bombing accuracy. American bombers proceeded through Japanese airspace at will. Their numbers and night operations overwhelmed defensive capabilities despite favorable altitude conditions. The validation LeMay's gamble. Over subsequent weeks, similar firebombing raids devastated Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, and dozens of smaller cities. The altitude advantage that had protected B-29s became irrelevant. They could operate effectively at any altitude because Japanese defenses couldn't stop mass attacks regardless of tactical conditions. The tactical shift invalidated Japanese high-altitude interceptor development programs overnight. Resources devoted to specialized high-altitude engines and pressurization research became irrelevant. The few advanced interceptors entering production, like the Mitsubishi J2M Raiden with its supercharged engine,
found themselves optimized for threats that no longer materialized.
As spring 1945 arrived, Japan's situation deteriorated on all fronts. American forces captured Okinawa, providing even closer bases for B-29 operations. P-51 Mustang fighters, flying from captured Iwo Jima, began escorting bombing raids deep into Japan. The arrival of long-range escorts transformed the tactical environment completely. Captain Yasuhiko Kuroe commanded the 64th Sentai, equipped with new Nakajima K-84 Hayate fighters, Japan's most advanced operational fighter. The K-84 performed impressively at medium altitudes, featuring a powerful Ha-45 engine that produced 1,900 horsepower. Pilots praised its maneuverability, speed, and heavy armament. Against American fighters at conventional altitudes, the K-84 proved formidable. But against high-altitude B-29s, the same limitations persisted. Despite improvements over earlier fighters, the K-84's ceiling topped out around 32,000 feet under ideal conditions. Maximum sustained altitude reached about 30,000 feet, still insufficient for reliable engagement of bombers cruising above 31,000 feet. The engine, though powerful, lacked effective high-altitude supercharging. Moreover, K-84 squadrons now had to penetrate P-51 escorts before reaching bombers. The American fighters established air superiority over Japan, making daylight operations increasingly suicidal for Japanese interceptors. Pilots who penetrated escort screens found themselves pursued while attempting bomber attacks, eliminating any chance for careful positioning or multiple passes. The few successful interceptions occurred during mining missions, where B-29s operated at reduced altitude over water. These lower-altitude operations allowed K-84s to demonstrate their capabilities, achieving several victories against bombers below 20,000 feet. But higher-altitude daylight raids remained largely immune from interception, despite K-84 improvements. June 1945 introduced the Kawasaki K-100, essentially a K-61 airframe with a reliable radial engine replacing troublesome inline power plants. The modification improved reliability dramatically, but reduced altitude performance. Pilots loved the K-100's handling characteristics and dependability, but it offered even less high-altitude capability than previous fighters. The radial engine configuration simply couldn't achieve the ceiling necessary for B-29 interception. By July, B-29 raids had destroyed much of Japan's urban industrial capacity. Cities that escaped firebombing suffered precision attacks on remaining factories and infrastructure. The systematic destruction of aircraft production facilities prevented any hope of matching American industrial output. Even if Japanese engineers designed perfect high-altitude interceptors, factories couldn't produce them in meaningful numbers. Meanwhile, American capabilities continued advancing. Modified silverplate B-29s, stripped of all defensive armament except tail guns, achieved even higher operational altitudes. These specialized aircraft, prepared for atomic bomb delivery, operated completely beyond Japanese interception capability. The mission profiles practiced by Colonel Paul Tibbets's 509th Composite Group emphasized maximum altitude approach, rapid weapon release, and high-speed escape, tactics enabled by the B-29's technological advantage. August 6, 1945, brought ultimate demonstration of altitude sanctuary. At 08:15, the B-29 Enola Gay approached Hiroshima at 31,600 feet. Japanese radar tracked the lone bomber throughout its approach. Fighter squadrons launched from nearby bases, providing perfect early warning for interception attempts.
Lieutenant Matsuo Yatsuzawa scrambled in his K-61 from Iwakuni Airfield less than 30 miles from Hiroshima. He climbed desperately toward the reported altitude, his engine immediately showing stress at maximum power. At 27,000 feet, his rate of climb dropped to barely 300 feet per minute. At 29,000 feet, engine temperature spiked into the red zone. He pushed harder, accepting that he was destroying the Ha-40 engine, but what choice remained? His altimeter touched 30,000 feet. The K-61 wallowed on the edge of a stall, barely controllable. Through his canopy, he could see the B-29, a silver speck perhaps 2,000 feet above, completely unreachable. He attempted a zoom climb, trading his remaining airspeed for a few hundred additional feet. At 08:15:17, at the precise moment Enola Gay's bomb bay doors opened and Little Boy began its fall toward Hiroshima, Yatsuzawa's fighter stalled at 30,400 feet, still 1,200 feet below the bomber. His aircraft tumbled through the sky as he fought for control, recovering several thousand feet lower. The atomic explosion occurred while Japanese fighters circled helplessly below, unable to intervene in or even comprehend the weapon being employed. The mushroom cloud rising over Hiroshima created a monument to technological supremacy, a weapon so powerful that its delivery platform required altitude capabilities beyond Japanese defensive reach. 3 days later, the story repeated. Boxcar approached Nagasaki at 28,000 feet. Multiple fighter squadrons launched, provided ample warning. Not one reached interception altitude. The second atomic weapon fell unopposed, demonstrating that Japanese air defenses had failed comprehensively. The altitude sanctuary that protected reconnaissance B-29s in the war's final days perhaps best symbolized the technological mismatch. Photo reconnaissance aircraft flew at 35,000 feet, mapping atomic bomb damage for American intelligence. Japanese fighters attempted interception, achieving perhaps 28,000 to 30,000 feet before physics prevented further climb. The reconnaissance superfortresses proceeded unmolested, documenting destruction at altitudes Japanese defenders couldn't reach.
Statistics don't capture the human reality of technological mismatch. Behind the numbers, 700 B-29s lost during the entire campaign, approximately 50 to Japanese fighters at altitude, lie stories of courage that technology rendered meaningless. B-29 tail gunner Staff Sergeant Robert Goldsworth recalled watching Japanese fighters struggle toward his aircraft during high-altitude missions. From my isolated position, I had the best view of their attempts. They'd appear as specks, growing slowly larger as they climbed. Some would fire from extreme range, tracers arcing up, but falling short by hundreds of yards. Others tried zoom climbs, trading all their speed for altitude. They'd hang motionless for a moment, almost reaching us, then stall and tumble away. I rarely fired. They never got close enough to threaten us. Watching their determination made me respect them, even as I recognized the futility. The psychological trauma extended beyond Japanese fighter pilots to ground observers and civilians. Watching vapor trails cross your city's sky at altitudes beyond defensive reach created profound sense of vulnerability. Citizens looked up, saw evidence of American bombers proceeding unopposed, understood that nothing protected them. The spectacle destroyed confidence in military assurances about homeland defense. Captain Iwao Hayashi, flying K-84s in the war's final months, described the helplessness. Despite flying Japan's most advanced fighter, reaching bomber altitude remained nearly impossible. The engine would cough and sputter above 30,000 feet, producing barely enough power to maintain flight. Controls became mushy, like flying through molasses. We'd make one pass if lucky, firing a short burst before stalling away. Watching them continue unharmed while our cities burned below created helplessness I'll never forget. We had failed not through cowardice, but through technology. That failure haunted me more than combat fear ever could.
American crews experienced their own moral complexity. B-29 radio operator Sergeant William Abel monitored Japanese fighter control frequencies during missions. We could hear their ground controllers vectoring fighters toward us, giving altitude and heading information. Then pilots would report they couldn't climb higher, engines overheating, losing power. Sometimes you'd hear anger in their voices, sometimes resignation. They knew where we were, knew what we were doing, but couldn't stop us. Technology determined everything. It felt wrong sometimes, knowing we had every advantage while they had nothing but courage. The March 9th Tokyo firebombing created particularly acute moral questions. Technical Sergeant James Pearson, flight engineer on board a B-29 during that mission, wrestled with what he witnessed. We flew at 7,000 feet, low enough to see details clearly. I watched Tokyo transform into an inferno, flames spreading faster than people could run. The thermal updrafts threw our bomber around like a toy. We could smell smoke through the aircraft seams, feel heat through the fuselage. Our bombardier threw up after bomb release, overwhelmed by what we'd done. Command told us we were destroying military-industrial capacity, but we knew we were burning civilians alive. The technology that protected us also enabled destruction on a scale that haunted us afterward. Japanese radar operator Corporal Shigeo Yamamoto experienced different but parallel trauma. Our equipment could track B-29 formations from hundreds of miles away, giving fighters plenty of warning. But warning meant nothing when our planes couldn't reach bomber altitude. I'd vector fighters toward intercept points knowing they'd fail. Pilots would report maximum altitude achieved, usually 27,000 or 28,000 feet, then watch bombers pass overhead at 31,000 feet. The frustration in their voices was heartbreaking. We had the will, but not the means. I felt complicit in our nation's defeat, despite doing everything possible within technological limitations. The atomic bomb missions created unique psychological burden for both sides. Enola Gay co-pilot Captain Robert Lewis wrote in his log immediately after bomb release, "My God, what have we done?" The scale of destruction visible even from 31,000 feet overwhelmed crew members who'd participated in conventional raids without such visceral reaction. The altitude that protected them also provided clear view of unprecedented devastation. Lieutenant Matsuo Yatsuzawa, who attempted intercepting Enola Gay, carried guilt for decades afterward. "I climbed until my engine literally caught fire, destroyed itself trying to reach that bomber. I got closer than most pilots that morning, within 1,200 feet. But close only matters in certain contexts. I couldn't stop the weapon that killed 80,000 people in seconds." Survivors accused us pilots of cowardice, failing to protect Hiroshima. They didn't understand we fought physics itself. Our aircraft simply couldn't reach enemy altitude. But try explaining that to someone who lost their entire family. Post-war analysis revealed the full extent of technological and industrial disparity that doomed Japanese air defense. Examining captured B-29s, Japanese engineers confronted innovations their industry couldn't replicate even with complete technical documentation. The pressurization system incorporated complex sealing mechanisms using synthetic rubber compounds Japan couldn't produce. Structural reinforcement for pressurization required precision welding techniques and quality control standards beyond Japanese manufacturing capabilities. Even basic components like electrical wiring used materials and insulation superior to Japanese equivalents. Remote turret control systems employed analog computers using vacuum tube technology more advanced than any Japanese military equipment. The servo mechanisms for gun control demonstrated precision manufacturing Japan couldn't achieve consistently. Fire control radar used components requiring tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch, precision Japanese wartime factories couldn't maintain.
The R-335 engines exemplified industrial superiority. Sodium-cooled valves prevented overheating at extreme temperatures. Precision-machined tolerances kept tight clearances despite thermal expansion. Specialized alloys in connecting rods and crankshafts handled stresses that would shatter Japanese equivalents.
The turbo-superchargers themselves required heat-resistant special steels and precision bearings that Japanese metallurgy couldn't produce. Maintenance officer Captain Hiroshi Fujiwara documented chronic problems with Japanese high-altitude operations. Quote, "Engine failures increased exponentially during maximum altitude attempts. The HA-40 engine in Ki-61s would overheat within minutes at full throttle above 25,000 feet. Oil pressure dropped, coolant boiled despite radiator modifications. Oxygen system malfunctions caused numerous pilot casualties, men passing out at altitude, some never recovering consciousness. Frostbite became common as pilots removed gloves to manipulate frozen controls. The cumulative mechanical failures made sustained high-altitude operations impossible, regardless of pilot determination. The industrial capacity gap extended beyond individual components to systemic production capability. America manufactured nearly 4,000 B-29s during the war, each requiring 55,000 parts from over 1,200 suppliers. Boeing's assembly line production achieved quality control and economies of scale impossible with Japanese cottage industry methods. Japan struggled to produce hundreds of fighters monthly, while American factories churned out thousands of aircraft. Material science limitations proved particularly crippling. High-grade aluminum alloys required for aircraft construction became increasingly scarce as Allied submarine warfare strangled Japanese supply lines. The special steels needed for superchargers and turbo-superchargers couldn't be produced domestically. Synthetic materials for sealants, insulation, and hundreds of minor components simply didn't exist in Japanese industry. Even when Japanese engineers designed competitive aircraft on paper, manufacturing realities prevented implementation. The Mitsubishi Ki-83 twin-engined Interceptor promised exceptional altitude performance with turbo-supercharged engines. Paper specifications suggested capability matching or exceeding B-29 ceiling, but development programs suffered from material shortages, manufacturing difficulties, and systematic destruction of production facilities by the very bombers the aircraft was designed to counter. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey conducted extensive post-war analysis, concluding that Japanese industrial capacity had been inadequate to wage modern technological warfare from the campaign's beginning. The gap widened systematically as American industry accelerated, while Japanese capacity degraded under strategic bombing pressure. Former Imperial Japanese Navy commander Masatake Okumiya's post-war analysis proved particularly insightful. Quote, "The B-29's altitude capability exceeded our intelligence estimates by at least 5,000 feet. We expected maximum operating altitudes around 26,000 feet based on B-17 and B-24 performance. When they routinely operated above 30,000 feet, our entire defensive strategy collapsed. We lacked time, resources, and technology to develop effective countermeasures. But more fundamentally, we lacked the industrial infrastructure necessary for modern technological warfare." The B-29 campaign over Japan established precedents that shaped military aviation development for generations. The lessons extended far beyond specific battles or technologies, fundamentally transforming understanding of modern warfare's nature. Strategic Air Command incorporated B-29 operational lessons into Cold War nuclear delivery doctrine. High-altitude penetration became foundational principle for strategic bomber employment against defended targets. The altitude sanctuary demonstrated over Japan influenced bomber development through the 1950s and beyond, leading to aircraft like the B-36, B-47, and eventually the B-52, each designed to operate at extreme altitudes beyond contemporary interceptor capability.
Pressurization technology advanced rapidly based on combat experience, transforming not just military aviation, but commercial air travel. Modern passenger aircraft owe their existence to innovations developed for B-29 high-altitude operations. Turbo-supercharging evolved into turbocharging and eventually turbojet and turbofan engines that power contemporary aircraft. The technological lineage traces directly from wartime innovations proven over Japan. The recognition that technology could prove decisive in warfare, regardless of enemy courage, influenced post-war military planning profoundly. During the Cold War, both superpowers invested enormous resources in maintaining technological advantages, understanding that courage alone couldn't overcome capability gaps. The nuclear deterrence strategy built partially on lessons from B-29 operations, demonstrating that advanced delivery platforms operating beyond defensive reach could carry weapons of ultimate destruction. Japanese post-war reconstruction included systematic study of American technological and industrial practices. Engineers who examined captured B-29s and studied American manufacturing techniques applied those lessons to rebuilding Japanese industry. The quality control standards, precision manufacturing techniques, and systems integration approaches observed in American military hardware influenced Japan's post-war industrial development significantly. The campaign also validated controversial aspects of strategic bombing doctrine, while raising profound ethical questions. LeMay's shift to area incendiary attacks achieved strategic effects precision bombing couldn't, but at horrific civilian cost. The technology that enabled altitude sanctuary for high-altitude missions also enabled low-altitude mass destruction. Modern debates about precision warfare, proportionality, and civilian casualties trace roots to these operations.
General Henry Arnold evaluated B-29 program success despite development costs exceeding the Manhattan Project. The strategic bombing campaign validated every dollar invested in advanced technology. The altitude sanctuary enabled precision attacks and atomic weapon delivery without prohibitive losses. We proved technological superiority could determine victory without massive ground invasions. The investment in pressurization, supercharging, and defensive systems paid dividends that shaped military aviation for decades. Former Ki-61 pilot Lieutenant Naoshi Kano's post-war reflections captured the human dimension. We were products of our industry's capabilities. Pilots train and fight with equipment available, not equipment we wish existed. Our determination matched any warrior tradition in history. We climbed until engines failed, attempting impossible interceptions. Some pilots deliberately rammed bombers, accepting certain death, but courage couldn't overcome altitude we physically couldn't reach. That lesson applies beyond specific battles. In modern warfare, industrial and technological capacity ultimately determines outcomes more than warrior spirit. The campaign demonstrated how industrial asymmetry compounds military advantages. America's ability to produce thousands of complex aircraft while simultaneously conducting massive ground campaigns showcased industrial might beyond Japanese comprehension. The B-29 program alone cost approximately $3 billion, exceeding Japan's total military aviation budget for the entire war. This disparity in resources and industrial capacity proved as decisive as any technological innovation. B-29 pilot Colonel Robert Robbins reflected on the psychological dimensions. Knowing enemy fighters couldn't reach us changed everything. We flew straight and level to targets, no evasive maneuvering needed. Bombardiers had stable platforms for accurate sighting. Crews stayed calm knowing the main threat came from mechanical problems, not enemy action. The confidence boost was enormous. We owned the sky above 30,000 feet, and everyone knew it. That psychological advantage translated into operational effectiveness, multiplying our technological edge. The recognition of technological defeat influenced Japanese military leadership's acceptance of unconditional surrender terms. General Korachika Anami's evaluation of home defense failures during final military conferences proved telling. B-29 altitude superiority negated Japan's geographic advantages and fighting spirit completely. Technical inferiority proved insurmountable despite tactical innovation and pilot sacrifice. Without ability to defend against B-29s, continuing resistance became meaningless sacrifice. Modern air defense systems trace evolutionary paths from lessons learned over Japan. The requirement for high-altitude interceptors drove jet fighter development. Surface-to-air missile technology emerged partially from recognition that conventional fighters couldn't reliably engage high-altitude bombers. The entire architecture of integrated air defense, combining radar detection, fighter interception, and surface-based weapons, evolved from confronting the challenges B-29 operations presented. November 24, 1944 marked a turning point not just in the Pacific War, but in understanding warfare's fundamental nature. Captain Tatsuo Yamada climbed that morning, believing determination could overcome any challenge. He discovered that some barriers exist beyond human will to surmount, barriers of physics, chemistry, and engineering that no amount of courage can breach. The B-29 raids over Japan demonstrated conclusively that modern warfare rewards industrial capacity and technological innovation more than traditional martial virtues. Japanese pilots proved their courage beyond question. They climbed until engines failed, attempted impossible interceptions. Some pilots deliberately rammed bombers, accepting certain death. It was not enough. American engineers in distant factories determined the campaign's outcome as much as pilots over Tokyo. The decision to invest in pressurization technology, to develop turbo-supercharging, to create precision manufacturing infrastructure, these choices made in conference rooms and engineering labs proved more decisive than any aerial combat maneuvers. The altitude sanctuary created by B-29 technology represents more than specific aircraft capability. It symbolizes how industrial societies wage war in the modern era. Victory accrues to nations that can mobilize scientific knowledge, industrial capacity, and engineering expertise at scale. Traditional military virtues, courage, discipline, tactical brilliance remain necessary but insufficient. The side with better technology, more sophisticated logistics, and greater industrial capacity starts with advantages that courage alone cannot overcome. This recognition shaped post-war military planning profoundly. Cold War superpowers invested enormous resources maintaining technological edges, understanding that falling behind industrially or scientifically could prove catastrophic. The nuclear deterrent strategy that prevented World War III built partially on lessons from B-29 operations, demonstrating that advanced delivery platforms beyond defensive reach could carry weapons of ultimate destruction. The campaign also poses uncomfortable questions about warfare's ethics when technological asymmetry becomes extreme. When one side possesses advantages so overwhelming that enemy cannot effectively resist, what responsibilities accompany that supremacy? The firebombing campaigns and atomic attacks enabled by B-29 altitude capability achieved strategic victory but raised moral questions debated still today. For Japanese pilots who survived, the memory never faded. Watching silver bombers pass overhead beyond reach,
Knowing their cities burned below while they remained powerless to intervene, that helplessness proved more psychologically damaging than combat fear. They had failed not through cowardice, but through industrial inadequacy beyond their control. The recognition that individual courage meant nothing against technological supremacy devastated warrior traditions built over centuries.
For American crews, the experience proved complex. They'd witnessed technology's power to enable destruction on unprecedented scale. Some, like Bombardier Lieutenant Marcus McDilda, wrestled with moral implications. The Japanese pilots showed incredible determination. We'd watch them climbing toward us for 15 or 20 minutes, struggling higher. Some would try zoom climbs, trading speed for altitude in desperate attempts to reach us. They'd fire a few rounds, usually falling short, then stall and spin away. Our gunners rarely needed to fire. Altitude was better protection than any armor. It was completely one-sided, determined by technology rather than courage. The veterans on both sides carried memories of technological mismatch that defined their understanding of modern warfare. They'd participated in a campaign demonstrating that engineering excellence and industrial capacity ultimately matter more than warrior spirit in determining outcomes. That lesson, proven in the skies over Japan between November 1944 and August 1945, shaped military planning for generations. Today, as nations compete through emerging technologies, artificial intelligence, hypersonic weapons, cyber capabilities, space systems, the fundamental lesson from B-29 raids remains relevant. Technological advantages compound rapidly in modern warfare. The side that innovates faster, produces better, and integrates more effectively starts with advantages that tactical brilliance and warrior courage cannot overcome. The altitude sanctuary created by B-29's engineering wasn't just about flying higher than Japanese fighters could reach. It represented American industrial civilization's triumph over Japanese martial tradition. It demonstrated that modern wars are won in universities developing new science, factories producing advanced weapons, and laboratories pushing technological boundaries as much as on battlefields where warriors fight. Captain Yamada survived the war. He watched from the ground as atomic weapons fell from silver plate B-29s he couldn't reach, ending the conflict he couldn't prevent. In post-war interviews, he spoke without bitterness. "We fought with everything we had, sacrificed beyond what most could imagine. We climbed until our engines died, attempted impossible missions, accepted death willingly, but we couldn't reach them. That's what I remember most, not fear or defeat, but the silver contrails passing overhead, beyond reach, proof that courage alone couldn't bridge the technological chasm." The contrails he remembered marked more than enemy bombers. They traced the trajectory of modern warfare's evolution, from individual combat to industrial contest, from warrior courage to engineering excellence, from traditional values to technological supremacy. The B-29 raids over Japan demonstrated this transformation more clearly than any previous campaign. In the end, Japanese pilots discovered what military leaders have relearned repeatedly since. In modern warfare, technology decides outcomes more than courage. The most determined warrior armed with inadequate equipment cannot defeat an adequately motivated opponent with superior tools. That lesson, purchased with the lives of tens of thousands on both sides, remains warfare's hardest truth. The silver B-29s that crossed Japan's skies at altitudes beyond defensive reach carried more than bombs. They carried proof of the age of warrior honor had yielded to the age of engineering excellence. That industrial might determined modern war's outcomes more than martial spirit. for pilots climbing desperately toward unreachable enemies, for civilians watching helplessly as their cities burned, for military leaders recognizing that courage couldn't overcome gaps. The B-29's altitude sanctuary delivered a verdict about modern warfare's nature that no amount of determination could appeal. The machine gun cruiser Helena had earned her nickname for rapid-firing guns. The B-29 Superfortress earned its place in history by flying beyond reach. Both represented American industrial supremacy, but the B-29's lesson proved more profound. In the technological age, the highest courage cannot breach barriers physics and engineering create. November 24, 1944, taught that lesson with clarity that echoes still today.